Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. I have some news for you. A while back, I asked where you'd prefer ads, and you know what? The response was clear. Most of you said no ads at all would be better. So I've made a decision. I've turned off monetization completely. From now on, it's ad-free, just like when I started this channel. If you do see any ads, that's YouTube placing them automatically, not me. From my side, no interruptions, just pure storytelling. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When I first read about this story, it stayed with me in a way that very few news stories ever have. It wasn't because of shock value or graphic details. It was because of how quietly horrifying it was, and how easy it was to imagine every step of what those children must have gone through. Even now, thinking about it makes my chest feel heavy. This happened in Greece, in an abandoned building that was already marked for demolition. The kind of place no one pays attention to anymore. Windows broken or boarded up, doors hanging loose, dust everywhere. A place adults walk past without a second glance. But to kids, especially boys, places like that can feel like adventure. Mystery, somewhere forbidden and exciting, somewhere that feels like a secret world. The two boys were brothers. One was 8 years old, the other was 6. Still very young. Barely old enough to fully understand danger, but old enough to be curious and brave in that careless way children often are. They didn't go there with bad intentions. They weren't trying to hurt anyone or cause serious trouble. They were just kids exploring a place they shouldn't have been, doing what kids do when there's no adult around to stop them. At some point, they entered the elevator. That alone is terrifying to think about. An elevator in an abandoned building is already unsafe. No maintenance, no inspections, no guarantee that anything works the way it should. But children don't think like that. To them, an elevator is just a box that moves. Something familiar, something they've ridden countless times before in malls or apartments. While inside the elevator, they decided to cut the power to the building. No one knows exactly why. Maybe it felt like a game. Maybe they wanted to see what would happen. Maybe they had seen adults flip switches or pull breakers before. Kids experiment. They don't understand consequences the way adults do. They don't imagine worst-case scenarios. When the power went out, the elevator stopped. Just like that. The doors didn't open. The lights likely went dark or dim. The elevator froze between floors, sealed shut inside a building no one was using, no one checking, no one listening. The boys were trapped. At first, they probably didn't panic. Or maybe they did, but in a confused, scattered way. Kids often don't immediately understand that a situation is truly dangerous. They might have laughed nervously, pressed buttons, tried to pry the doors open. They might have called out, assuming someone would hear them. But no one did. This building was abandoned, scheduled for demolition. That means no workers, no guards, no cleaners, no residents. Just empty space and silence. Imagine being that small, inside a metal box, with no way out, no idea how long you'll be there, and no adult to help you. The fear wouldn't come all at once. It would build slowly, turning from confusion into panic. They would have screamed, they would have cried, they would have banged on the walls and the doors until their hands hurt, until their throats were raw, until exhaustion forced them to stop. But even then, they wouldn't understand why no one was coming. For a while, they might have believed help was on the way. Children often do. They trust that adults will fix things, that someone will notice they're missing, that someone will hear them, eventually. But hours would pass, then more hours. The elevator wouldn't move, the doors wouldn't open, the darkness would feel thicker, The air would feel stale. Hunger would begin as a dull ache, then grow sharper. Thirst would become unbearable, and still no one came. At some point, they would have realized this wasn't a short delay. This wasn't a broken ride that would restart. This was something else, something worse. It's almost impossible to imagine the fear they must have felt at that realization. Two children alone, trapped, completely powerless. They would have cried for their parents, called each other's names, held on to each other. The younger one likely clung to the older one, trusting him to know what to do. The older one, only 8 years old, forced into a role he was never meant to have. Protector, comforter, decision-maker, all while being just as scared. Time would have lost meaning. Inside an elevator, there's no sense of day or night, no windows, no sunlight, no way to mark hours passing. Hunger and thirst would be the only clocks. Fatigue would blur their thoughts. Panic would come in waves. Eventually, their bodies would start to weaken. Without food and water, children deteriorate quickly, much faster than adults. Their energy would drain. Their voices would grow quieter. Screaming would turn into sobbing, then into silence broken only by occasional whimpers. The details that were reported later make the story even harder to bear. They were found dead, starved, and covered in their own feces and urine. That isn't meant to be sensational. It's the brutal reality of what happens when the body shuts down in a confined space. When fear and weakness strip away dignity, when survival becomes impossible. That detail alone tells you how long they were trapped. This wasn't a few hours. This wasn't even a single day. This was long enough for their bodies to completely fail. Long enough for them to be too weak to move properly, too weak to cry, too weak to help each other. One of them died first. That thought is unbearable. One brother watching the other fade, watching him stop responding, not understanding why. Not knowing what death really is, only knowing that something is terribly wrong. The older one might have tried to shake the younger, called his name, promised him they would be rescued, promised him their parents were coming, and then realizing he was alone. Imagine being 8 years old and experiencing that. He's sitting in a dark elevator with the body of your younger brother, hungry, thirsty, exhausted, terrified, grieving, and knowing, on some level, that no one is coming. How long did he live after that? Hours? A day? We don't know. But we know he lived long enough to understand loss before he died himself. That detail is what wrecked me when I read about this story. It's not just that 2 children died. It's the way they died. Slowly, quietly, hidden from the world, with no one to comfort them, no one to tell them it would be okay, no one to hold them and take away their fear. This wasn't an accident that happened in a second. It wasn't instant. It was drawn out. And every moment of it must have felt endless to them. What makes this even worse is how preventable it was. If the building had been properly secured, if the power controls had been inaccessible, if the elevator doors had been locked, if someone had checked the building regularly, if someone had heard them, if someone had noticed they were missing sooner. So many small failures stacked on top of each other, all leading to this outcome. It also raises painful questions about how long it took for anyone to realize what had happened. How long were those boys missing before anyone started searching? Did people assume they were playing somewhere else? Did time slip by before the alarm was raised? By the time they were found, it was far too late. I try not to imagine the moment they were discovered, but it's hard not to. The silence inside that elevator, the smell, the realization of what had happened. The shock of knowing that 2 children had been suffering in that space while the world moved on above them. Stories like this force you to confront how fragile life really is, especially for children, how quickly curiosity can turn into tragedy, how a single bad decision made without understanding can trap someone in a situation they cannot escape from. It also highlights how dangerous abandoned places really are. Adults romanticize them sometimes. Urban exploration, forgotten buildings, empty spaces. But those places are full of hidden hazards, unstable structures, broken systems, locked spaces with no safety measures. To a child, an abandoned building doesn't look dangerous. It looks like a playground, a castle, a mystery to be solved. And that's what makes this so heartbreaking. These boys weren't doing anything unusual for their age. They weren't reckless in a way that feels malicious. They were just kids being kids in a world that failed to protect them. I keep thinking about their parents. The moment they realized something was wrong. The moment they learned where their children were found. There is no language strong enough to describe that kind of pain. No way to make sense of it. No closure that could ever exist. And I think about how quiet this story was. It wasn't a massive international headline for long. It didn't dominate the news cycle for weeks. Like many tragedies involving children, it appeared, horrified people briefly, and then faded. But it shouldn't fade, because stories like this matter, not as horror, but as warning, as reminder, as proof that safety isn't automatic and that negligence, or even unintentional, can kill. This story destroyed me because it made me imagine something no one should ever have to imagine. Two brothers alone in the dark, facing hunger, fear, and death together, holding on to each other until one couldn't anymore. The thought of them crying hysterically at first, then becoming too weak to cry at all, is unbearable. The thought of silence replacing screams is worse. The thought of one brother dying and the other having to live with that reality, even briefly before dying himself, feels like a cruelty beyond words. There was no monster in this story, no villain in the traditional sense, no malicious person actively harming them, just neglect, abandonment, broken systems, locked doors, and that almost makes it worse, because it means this could happen again, somewhere in some forgotten place. There are still abandoned buildings, broken elevators, unsafe spaces, curious children, gaps in supervision, assumptions that nothing will happen. This story reminds us that something always can happen, that safety measures exist for a reason, that abandoned doesn't mean harmless, that silence doesn't mean peace, and that children rely completely on the adults and systems around them to keep them alive. Every time I think about those boys, I feel a mix of sadness, anger, and helplessness. Sadness for their suffering, anger at how easily it could have been prevented, helplessness because nothing can undo what they went through. That story didn't scare me in a traditional way. It didn't make me jump or feel adrenaline. It wrecked me slowly, the way grief does, the way imagining someone else's pain can leave a permanent mark. And even now, long after reading about it, I still find myself thinking about them in quiet moments, wondering what they were saying to each other, wondering if they held hands, wondering if the older one tried to be brave until the very end. Some stories don't need monsters, ghosts, or violence to be terrifying. Sometimes all it takes is two kids, a broken elevator, and a world that never heard them screaming. An older friend of mine was a U.S. Marine. He doesn't talk about his service often, and when he does, he never sounds proud or dramatic. There's no excitement in his voice, no sense that he's telling a war story. It always feels more like he's opening a door to something he normally keeps locked, letting a little of it spill out before quietly closing it again. He was medically discharged, and even that phrase feels too clean and simple for what he actually carried home with him. The story he shared with me once is the scariest thing I've ever heard come from someone I know personally. Not because it sounded like a movie, but because it didn't. It sounded disjointed, heavy, and unfinished, like a memory that still lives inside him instead of something that happened a long time ago. He was on patrol somewhere in Afghanistan, See, he never said exactly where, and I never asked. The way he talked about it made it clear that the location itself didn't matter. What mattered was the moment. He was part of a small team, 6 Marines moving through an area that had already been damaged by fighting. Buildings were partially collapsed, streets torn up, debris everywhere. Places like that mess with your head, he said, because nothing looks stable and anything can hide something lethal. They were alert, but it wasn't chaos. Patrols like that often settled into a strange rhythm. You're tense, but you're also moving, scanning, listening, watching for changes. He said that sometimes the most dangerous moments don't feel dangerous at first. They feel almost boring, and that's what makes them deadly. At some point, a truck pulled out from a wrecked building ahead of them. That alone was enough to make everyone lock in. A vehicle coming out of a destroyed structure isn't normal. It's not someone going about their day. It's a question mark. And in that environment, question marks are treated like threats until proven otherwise. The truck started driving toward them, not fast, but not hesitant either. Just moving, closing distance. My friend and the rest of his team raised their weapons and aimed at the truck while it was still moving. They were trained for this exact situation. Commands would have been shouted, hands tight on triggers, eyes fixed, every second stretched thin. The truck stopped about 40 feet away. That's close, closer than most people realize when they picture combat. 40 feet isn't a distant speck. It's across a small room, across a short street. You can see faces at that distance. You can see body language. You can see intent. Then the doors opened. 8 men got out. 4 of them were carrying AK-style rifles. The other 4 were wearing vests. Not armor, suicide vests. The moment confirmed what everyone already feared. They didn't hesitate. They didn't shout. They didn't try to talk. They rushed the squad. Everything that happened next happened fast, but not fast enough to blur together in my friend's memory. He remembered details in a way that haunted him. Who was where, how close they were, the sound of boots on broken ground, the way adrenaline sharpens everything instead of softening it. The squad opened fire. Rounds hit bodies, people fell. One of the attackers, the one holding a dead man's switch, kept coming. A dead man's switch is designed so that if the person holding it releases pressure, the device detonates. It's a final guarantee. There's no bargaining with someone holding one, no disarming them safely. The only way to stop it is to stop the person. That man got close, too close. He was killed just before he reached the squad, but killing him wasn't enough. The moment he died, the device detonated. My friend didn't describe it in cinematic terms. He didn't talk about fireballs or shockwaves the way movies do. He said it was like the world punched him, like everything turned white and loud at the same time, like being slammed by something you never saw coming, even though you knew it was coming. It wasn't a normal explosion, it was a dirty bomb. A dirty bomb isn't about a massive blast. It's about shrapnel and radiation. Metal fragments packed into an explosive. He combined with radioactive material designed to contaminate everything and everyone nearby. The goal isn't just to kill in the moment, it's to poison whoever survives. All 6 of them were hit almost point blank. Dozens of metal fragments tore through their bodies, tiny pieces, jagged and fast, ripping into flesh, embedding themselves in muscle, bone, organs. At the same time, they were exposed to radiation at extremely close range. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to leave a mark that would follow them for the rest of their lives. My friend said it didn't hurt right away the way you'd expect. Pain came later. At first, there was confusion, ringing ears, a sense that something was wrong, but no clear picture of what. He remembered trying to move and realizing his leg didn't feel right. He remembered looking at the others and seeing blood, smoke, dust, and expressions he still can't fully describe. 4 of them died. Not all at once, not cleanly. They died from injuries, complications, and the aftermath. Some died there, some later. My friend doesn't like to separate it into timelines. To him, they're just gone. 3 of the survivors developed cancer. Radiation doesn't announce itself immediately. It waits. It damages cells quietly, invisibly, until months or years later, something grows where it shouldn't. My friend watched men he served with survive the explosion, survive surgeries, survive recovery, only to be told later that their bodies were failing them from the inside out. As for him, he still has more than 15 metal fragments embedded in his hip. They couldn't remove all of them, as some were too close to nerves, some were too deep, some were safer to leave than to try to take out. So he carries them. Every step, every movement, every cold day when his hip aches and reminds him of where they came from. That's what medically discharged means in his case. It means shrapnel that never leaves. It means radiation exposure that will always be a question mark hanging over his future. It means memories that don't fade because they're tied to physical sensations. Pain, stiffness, fatigue, doctor visits, scans, tests, waiting rooms. It also means living with the knowledge that 4 men died next to you and you didn't. He doesn't talk much about survivors' guilt, but you can hear it in the pauses, in the way his voice changes when he mentions numbers instead of names, in the way he downplays his own injuries while casually mentioning cancer like it's just another side effect. What struck me most when he told this story wasn't just the violence, it was how matter-of-fact he was about it. Not because it didn't affect him, but because it affected him so deeply that there was no room left for dramatics. He said something once that stuck with me. He said the worst part wasn't the explosion. It wasn't even the injuries, it was realizing how close they were. 40 feet, that's it. He said that when people imagine war, they imagine distance. Snipers, drones, bombs falling from the sky. But sometimes it's just a handful of people standing close enough to see each other breathe, and one moment decides who goes home and who doesn't. He also talked about how unfair it felt afterward. The attackers were dead. Their part was over, but the damage they caused kept going, kept spreading through hospital rooms, through funerals, through long-term illnesses, through families trying to understand why someone came back different, or didn't come back at all. He never talks about politics. He never talks about whether the war was right or wrong. He talks about bodies, about consequences, about how violence doesn't stop when the noise does. Even years later, he still goes in for checkups, still gets scans, still wonders if something new will show up. Cancer is a shadow that never fully leaves once you've been exposed like that. Every ache becomes suspicious. Every test result feels loaded. He walks with a slight limp some days. Other days he looks fine. That's another thing people don't understand. You don't always see the damage. Sometimes it's hidden under clothes, under skin, under silence. When he told me this story, there was a long pause afterward. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't feel small or wrong. Saying "I'm sorry" felt useless. Saying "thank you for your service" felt even worse. What do you thank someone for when their service cost them their friends, their health, and their peace? The story scared me in a way no horror movie ever could. Because this wasn't a story meant to scare, it was just something that happened. Something real, something that could happen again to someone else, somewhere else, right now. It made me think about how close ordinary life sits next to unimaginable violence. How people go from standing in a street with their friends to being blown apart in seconds. How the aftermath stretches on quietly, long after the news stops caring. My friend survived, but survival came with a price. Metal in his body, radiation in his past, cancer around the corner for others, memories that don't soften with time. When people talk about war in abstract terms, it feels distant, strategic, historical. But when someone you know looks at you and tells you that 4 people died 40 feet away from him, and that he still carries pieces of that moment inside his body, it stops being abstract. It becomes personal. And the scariest part is knowing that for him, this isn't a story he heard or read. It's something he lived, something that still lives with him, and something that will never really be over, no matter how many years pass. This is one of those stories that feels unreal the first time you hear it, like something pulled from a Gothic novel rather than real life. But the most disturbing part is that it actually happened, and not in some distant ancient time either. It happened in a world with neighbors, laws, letters, and people who could have helped if they had known. That's what makes it so hard to sit with. The cruelty wasn't sudden, it wasn't impulsive. It was slow, deliberate, and sustained for decades. Blanche Monnier was born into a wealthy, respected family in France. From the outside, they appeared proper, refined, and well-connected. Her mother was socially prominent and deeply concerned with reputation, class, and appearances. Blanche herself was known as a beautiful young woman, as someone who was expected to make a suitable marriage that would further the family's standing. But Blanche fell in love with a man her mother did not approve of. That single fact sealed her fate. The man Blanche wanted to marry did not meet her mother's standards, whether it was his social status, his finances, his politics, or simply the fact that Blanche had chosen him for herself, rather than submitting to her mother's wishes. We'll never fully know. What is clear is that her mother saw the relationship as unacceptable and intolerable, and rather than allowing her daughter to make her own choices, she decided to erase the problem entirely. Blanche was locked away, not for days, not for weeks, but for 25 years. She was confined to a small, dark room in the family home. The windows were shuttered. Light barely entered. The air was stale. She was placed on a straw mattress, not a bed, and left there like an object that had been put into storage rather than a living person. The door was kept locked. She was isolated from the world completely. At first, Blanche resisted. She begged. She cried. She pleaded to be let out, to see people, to live her life. But time has a way of crushing resistance when there is no hope and no escape. Days turned into months. Months into years. Eventually, her protests faded, not because she accepted her fate, but because her body and mind could no longer sustain the effort. Food was provided sporadically and cruelly, scraps, leftovers, sometimes food that had already gone bad. There was no care taken to ensure nutrition, cleanliness, or dignity. She was almost starved, kept alive but barely. Over time, her weight dropped to a horrifying level. When she was finally found, she weighed around 25 kilograms, roughly 55 pounds. That is the weight of a small child, not an adult woman. There was no proper sanitation. She was not allowed to bathe. She had no toilet. Waste accumulated in the room. Old food was left to rot. Insects crawled freely around her mattress, the floor, the walls. Bugs lived in the space with her, feeding on the same scraps and filth that surrounded her. Over time, layers of grime, decay, and bodily waste built up around her. People later described a crust-like buildup formed from food scraps, excrement, and neglect that had never been cleaned away. It's difficult to even imagine what that environment would do to a human being. Human beings are not meant to live without light, without touch, without movement, without clean air, without social contact. Blanche was deprived of all of it. Her senses were dulled and distorted. Her sense of time disappeared. Her understanding of reality fractured. And all of this happened while life went on normally in the rest of the house. Her mother continued to live her life. She attended social events. maintained her reputation, spoke with neighbors, presented herself as respectable and proper. Blanche's brother also lived in the house. He knew Blanche was there. He knew she was locked away. He did nothing to stop it. That fact is almost as horrifying as the imprisonment itself. Blanche was not hidden in some remote location. She was locked in a room in a house where people lived their daily lives. Meals were eaten, conversations were held, guests may have visited, and all the while just beyond a locked door, a woman was being slowly destroyed. The only reason Blanche was eventually found was because of an anonymous letter. Someone, we still don't know who, sent a letter to the authorities describing the situation. The letter claimed that a woman had been imprisoned in her mother's home for decades, living in appalling conditions. At first, the claim seemed unbelievable. It sounded too extreme, too cruel to be true. But authorities decided to investigate. When police entered the house and forced their way into the locked room, they were confronted with a scene that shocked even seasoned officials. The smell alone was overwhelming. The room was dark, filthy, and crawling with insects. Blanche was found lying on her straw mattress, barely recognizable as a human being. She was emaciated to the point of looking skeletal. Her skin was in terrible condition. Her hair was matted. She was covered in filth. She had not seen sunlight in years. She had been reduced to something her captors no longer seemed to view as a person. When they removed her from the room, she reacted in ways that revealed just how deeply damaged she was. Light hurt her eyes, sounds overwhelmed her. Human contact frightened her. The world outside the room was no longer familiar or safe. She had been conditioned to darkness, silence, and isolation. Her mother was arrested. Shortly after, she died. Some people see this as a form of cosmic justice. Others see it as deeply unsatisfying. She never truly faced the consequences of what she had done. She never had to live with the same suffering she inflicted. She never had to endure even a fraction of what Blanche endured. The brother, who had lived in the house and allowed this to happen, was put on trial. He was acquitted. The reasoning was that he had not physically imprisoned Blanche himself, and that the legal responsibility fell on the mother. This legal outcome is one of the most infuriating parts of the story, because while he may not have locked the door with his own hands, he lived with the knowledge of what was happening and chose silence over action for decades. Blanche survived her rescue, but survival is not the same as recovery. The damage done to her body and mind was profound and permanent. After 25 years of deprivation, her ability to eat normally was severely impaired. She developed serious eating disorders. Her relationship with food had been completely warped by starvation and neglect. She also developed behaviors that reflected the extreme conditions she had been forced to live in. One of the most disturbing was coprophilia, the act of eating feces. This is not a moral failing or a choice in such cases. It is a trauma response. When a person is deprived of food and dignity for long enough, survival instincts override all normal boundaries. What once was unthinkable becomes normalized. Her mental health suffered enormously. She developed schizophrenia and other severe psychiatric conditions. Her grasp on reality was fragile. Years of sensory deprivation, isolation, and abuse had reshaped her brain. She struggled with paranoia, delusions, and emotional instability. Social interaction was difficult, sometimes impossible. She spent the rest of her life institutionalized, receiving care but never truly free of the consequences of her imprisonment. The world she returned to was not the world she had left. It had changed beyond recognition, and she herself had been changed beyond repair. There are photographs of Blanche after her rescue. Those images are difficult to forget once you've seen them. They don't feel like historical artifacts. They feel invasive, like glimpses into suffering that no one should ever have had to endure. The images show a person who looks more like a ghost than a woman. Eyes hollow, body ravaged, presence fragile. People often say the photos haunt them forever, and it's not an exaggeration. What makes this story especially horrifying is not just the abuse itself, but the motivation behind it. This wasn't done out of desperation. It wasn't done because of poverty or war or chaos. It was done because a mother wanted control, because she valued social standing and obedience more than her daughter's humanity, because she believed she had the right to decide her daughter's entire existence. Blanche's only crime was wanting to marry someone she loved. That's it. No violence, no rebellion, no scandal, just love and autonomy, and for that, she lost 25 years of her life. This story forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse that doesn't look like what people expect. Abuse doesn't always involve shouting or bruises or visible chaos. Sometimes it wears the mask of respectability. Sometimes it hides behind closed doors in beautiful homes. Sometimes it's enforced quietly through control, isolation, and silence. It also shows how powerful family dynamics can be, especially when combined with social pressure and unquestioned authority. Blanche's mother was able to do what she did because no one challenged her, because her position in society protected her, because people assumed that a respectable woman could not possibly be doing something so monstrous, and because the people closest to Blanche failed her, again and again. When people ask why stories like this still matter, the answer is simple. Because they show how easily cruelty can be normalized when it happens slowly. Because they remind us that not all prisons have bars. And because they force us to examine how often society looks away when something makes it uncomfortable. Blanche Monnier didn't disappear overnight. She vanished gradually behind a locked door while life went on around her. Birthdays were celebrated, meals were eaten, conversations were had, all while she lay in darkness, wasting away. That's what makes the story unbearable. Not just the suffering itself, but the indifference that allowed it to continue for a quarter of a century. When Blanche was finally freed, people spoke of rescue and justice. But rescue came too late. Justice barely came at all. What she lost could never be returned. Youth, love, choice, a normal life. She lived the rest of her years carrying the consequences of a decision she never made. This story stays with people because it strips away comforting illusions. It shows that the worst horrors don't always come from strangers or monsters. Sometimes they come from family, from respectability, from love twisted into ownership. And once you understand that, once you really sit with it, it becomes impossible to forget. Blanche Monnier survived, but she was never truly free, and that might be the most haunting part of all. This is one of those stories that doesn't sound real when you first hear it, but the more you think about it, the worse it gets. It isn't frightening because of violence or mystery. It's frightening because of how quiet it was, how unnoticed it was, and how easily it could happen to almost anyone. My girlfriend's parents live near a very busy motorway. It's one of those roads that never really sleeps. Day or night, there's always traffic. Cars, trucks, buses, headlights streaming past non-stop. People who live nearby get used to the noise. It becomes background sound, something you barely notice after a while. One Friday night, a man was riding his motorbike home after a long shift at work. From what was later pieced together, he was exhausted. He wasn't speeding. If anything, he was riding slowly, carefully, just trying to get home safely after a long day. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't reckless. He was doing what millions of people do every week, commuting home and expecting to sleep in their own bed. Somewhere along that motorway, another driver came up behind him. For reasons no one will ever fully know, the driver of the car became impatient. Maybe they thought the bike was going too slowly. Maybe they were tired, angry, distracted, or just didn't care. What is known is that the car hit the motorbike, knocking the rider off. And then the driver didn't stop. They didn't pull over. They didn't call for help. They didn't check if the man was alive. They just drove away, disappearing into the flow of traffic like nothing had happened. The motorbike ended up damaged and abandoned on the motorway, but the rider himself didn't die immediately. That's the part that's hardest to accept. Somehow, after being knocked off the bike, he ended up in the central reservation of the motorway, the narrow strip between lanes often lined with barriers, grass, or concrete. A place designed to separate traffic, not protect people. From the road, it's not a place you expect to see someone standing or lying, especially at night, especially when cars are moving fast. He was injured, badly injured, but he was alive, and then nothing happened. No one stopped. No one noticed. Hundreds of cars passed by. Thousands, probably. Headlights flashing past, engines roaring, people focused on their own destinations. Some drivers may have seen something out of the corner of their eye and assumed it was debris, a shadow, a reflection, something that didn't register as a human being. The man was hidden just enough from view that he wasn't obvious, not clearly visible from the lanes, not in a place where drivers expect to see a person. The motorway kept moving, indifferent, relentless. He lay there, injured, alone, and dying. From what authorities later determined, he didn't die quickly. It was a slow, painful death, the kind that stretches on, where shock fades and pain sets in, where confusion mixes with fear, where you realize help isn't coming, even though you can hear people all around you. That's the part that haunts me the most. He could hear cars, he could hear life continuing, he could hear the world moving on without him, all while he lay there, unable to get up, unable to signal for help, unable to make himself seen. Imagine that kind of terror. You're injured, possibly bleeding internally, and maybe unable to move your legs properly. Your phone might be broken or out of reach. Even if you had it, would it work? Would you be conscious enough to use it? Would anyone know where you are? Every passing minute, your strength drains away. Your body grows colder. Pain pulses through you. You try to shout, but the sound of traffic drowns everything out. Even if you scream, no one hears you. Or if they do, they don't understand what they're hearing. He was right there, and no one knew. The truly disturbing part is how long it took before anyone even realized something was wrong. The man didn't make it home that night, but people miss a night sometimes. Phones die. People crash at a friend's place. Sometimes you're just exhausted and sleep through alarms. There was no immediate reason for panic. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. It wasn't until Monday, when he didn't show up for work, that concern really set in. Co-workers noticed. They tried to reach him. Calls went unanswered. Messages weren't read. That's when the situation shifted from maybe he's just unavailable to something is wrong. Search efforts began. Authorities started looking for him. They retraced possible routes. Eventually, they found his motorbike, damaged, abandoned. That confirmed everyone's worst fear. He'd been in an accident, but even then, they didn't find him. Think about how terrifying that must have been for his family. Knowing he'd crashed, but not knowing where he was. Not knowing if he was alive or dead. Not knowing if he was hurt somewhere, waiting for help, or already gone. Days went by, and then, finally, someone saw him. His body was found in the central reservation of the motorway, the same motorway where traffic had been flowing nonstop, the same place hundreds of people had driven past every hour. He had been there the whole time, dead. When investigators put everything together, they realized the truth was far worse than a fatal crash. He hadn't died on impact. He had survived the initial collision, which means that after being hit, after being thrown from his bike, after being left behind by the driver who caused it. He had been alive for some time, long enough to suffer, long enough to feel fear, long enough to hope, at least at first, that someone would notice him. But no one did. That realization changes everything. This wasn't just a hit and run. It was abandonment. It was negligence. It was a man being left to die in one of the busiest places imaginable, completely invisible. When people talk about dying alone, they usually imagine isolation, a remote place, a forest, a desert, somewhere far from civilization. This man died alone, in the middle of it, surrounded by people, surrounded by movement, surrounded by noise, and still invisible. I can't stop thinking about what those hours must have been like. Lying there, injured, listening to cars rush past, wondering why no one was stopping, wondering if anyone even saw him, wondering how long he could hold on. Did he think help was coming at first? Most people would. After an accident on a motorway, you expect emergency services, you expect traffic to stop, you expect chaos. Instead, there was nothing. Did he try to move and realize he couldn't? Did he feel his strength fading? Did he understand at some point that he wasn't going to be rescued? Those thoughts are unbearable. What makes this story even harder to process is how random it was. This wasn't a dangerous lifestyle. This wasn't someone taking extreme risks. This was a tired man riding home from work, someone's co-worker, someone's friend, someone's family member. One impatient driver made a decision. One person chose not to stop. And that decision didn't just cause an accident. It caused a slow death. The motorway didn't care. The cars didn't stop. The systems designed to detect incidents failed. Human attention failed. Assumptions took over. If something were wrong, someone else would handle it. That's a terrifying thought. How many times do we pass by something slightly out of place and assume it's nothing? How many times do we think someone else has already reported it? How many times do we keep going because stopping feels inconvenient or uncertain? This story forces you to confront the fact that sometimes no one else is paying attention. The central reservation is meant to be a buffer, a safety feature, but in this case, it became a hiding place. A place where a human being could disappear in plain sight. It also highlights how vulnerable motorcyclists are. One impact can send them flying. One careless driver can end their life. And if no one takes responsibility, the consequences multiply. I think about his final moments more than I want to. The pain, the fear, the confusion, the loneliness, and above all, the sound of traffic continuing like nothing had happened. That sound must have been unbearable. Every car that passed without stopping was another reminder that help wasn't coming. Another reminder that he was unseen. This story isn't dramatic in the way people expect horror to be. There's no monster, no chase, no sudden shock. Just neglect and indifference stretching out over hours and days. And that's why it's so disturbing. It makes you realize how fragile safety really is, how dependent we are on strangers doing the right thing, how quickly a normal night can turn into a nightmare without witnesses. It also makes you wonder how many other stories like this exist, how many people have been injured and left behind in places where everyone assumed someone else would act, how many times systems failed silently. Whenever I drive on that motorway now, I think about him. About how close he was to help and how far away it actually was. Say, about how many people passed within feet of him without knowing he was there. It changes how you see roads, how you see traffic, how you see the idea of busy places being safe by default. Busy doesn't mean protected. Busy doesn't mean watched. Sometimes, busy just means people moving too fast to notice what matters. This story sticks with me because it could happen anywhere. Any motorway, any tired worker, any impatient driver, any night. And the idea that someone can suffer and die slowly, hidden in plain sight while the world rushes past, is one of the most unsettling things I can imagine. Not because it's rare, but because it's possible. This is one of those stories that sits in a very uncomfortable place because it doesn't feel sensational or exaggerated. It feels bleak, quiet, and painfully plausible. The kind of story that doesn't shock you all at once, but slowly sinks in as you realize how easily it could happen, especially in a different time, with fewer safeguards and in complete isolation. The story is set back in the 1980s or early 1990s, a time when medical access worked very differently than it does now. Emergency dental care wasn't treated with the same urgency it is today, especially in rural areas. If you came in with an abscessed tooth, you might be given antibiotics and painkillers and told to come back later, sometimes much later. Dentistry was overloaded, understaffed, and often dismissive of how severe dental pain could actually become. This guy came in with an abscessed tooth. Anyone who has ever had one knows that this isn't just a toothache. An abscess is an infection, and it can cause constant, throbbing, relentless pain. The kind of pain that radiates into your jaw, your ear, your temple. The kind that doesn't let you sleep, doesn't let you think, doesn't let you eat properly. It's not sharp and quick. It's deep, pulsing, and unending. At the time, they couldn't get him in right away. He was told he'd have to wait until a later date for proper treatment. Again, that wasn't unusual back then, especially if you weren't actively dying in front of them. Dental pain was often minimized. People were expected to tough it out. And he did, at least at first. What makes this story take such a dark turn is what he decided to do next. Despite the pain, or maybe because he thought he could push through it, he went ahead with a planned solo hunting trip. A one-man trip deep into the middle of nowhere. This wasn't a casual weekend getaway. This was the kind of trip where you deliberately cut yourself off from the outside world. No phones, no radios, no way to call for help. Just you, your gear, and nature. Before he left, he gave very specific instructions. He told people not to come looking for him, not to pick him up, not to check in. He said he'd be gone for 2 weeks and would return on his own. That detail alone is unsettling in hindsight. At the time, it probably didn't raise alarms. People went off-grid more easily back then. A solo hunting trip wasn't seen as strange or dangerous. It was normal, especially for someone experienced and comfortable outdoors. So the instructions not to come looking for him likely sounded practical, not ominous. But once you know how the story ends, that detail takes on a much heavier meaning. Out there, alone, the pain didn't get better. It got worse. Dental abscesses don't just hurt. They can spread infection. They can cause fever, chills, swelling, and a sense of pressure that feels like your head might split open. The pain is constant. There's no relief. You can't distract yourself from it when you're alone in silence. Sleep becomes impossible. And that's where things begin to spiral. A couple of days without sleep can completely alter a person's mental state. Add constant, severe pain to that, and it becomes a perfect storm. Judgment deteriorates, thoughts loop endlessly, small problems feel insurmountable. Despair sets in quietly but firmly. Though in the middle of nowhere, there was no dentist, no doctor, no emergency room, no antibiotics refill, no stronger pain relief, no reassurance that the pain would end soon. Just him, the pain, and the realization that it might continue like this for days or weeks. People underestimate how much pain can break a person down psychologically. Chronic, unrelenting pain doesn't just hurt the body, it erodes hope. It strips away the ability to think clearly. It convinces you that the pain will never stop, even when intellectually you might know that it eventually could. But pain doesn't speak to logic, it speaks to desperation. At some point during that trip, something inside him snapped. When the retrieval crew eventually went to find him, they didn't find a man waiting to be picked up. They found his body. He had taken his own life. The phrase often used in the retelling is blunt and uncomfortable, but the reality behind it is even more disturbing. He had reached a point where the pain, the isolation, the lack of sleep, and the absence of help made death feel like the only way out. What truly seals the credibility of this story for many people is the suicide note. It didn't talk about depression or a desire to die or hopelessness in the abstract. It talked about pain, about unbearable pain, about how what he was going through made this feel like his only option, and it ended with instructions to tell his family that he loved them. That kind of note doesn't sound theatrical. It sounds exhausted. It sounds like someone who didn't want to die, but couldn't see a way to keep living in that moment. People sometimes dismiss stories like this as exaggerated or made up, especially when they come from places like Reddit. Grain of salt is the usual response, but if you talk to people who work in dentistry, emergency medicine, or pain management, you start to hear a very different perspective. Dental infections can be brutal. They can spread to the brain. They can cause sepsis. They can cause delirium. They can trigger extreme psychological distress, especially when untreated. Pain of that magnitude, combined with fever and sleep deprivation, can push otherwise stable people into crisis very quickly. Now add isolation to that equation. No one to talk to, no reassurance, no countdown clock saying, just 3 more days. No way to check in, no way to hear a human voice. Just silence and pain reinforcing each other. It's not hard to imagine how someone could lose their grip on reality in that situation. People often talk about suicide as if it always comes from long-term mental illness or deep, pre-existing despair. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it comes from acute, overwhelming circumstances, a convergence of factors that crush a person's ability to cope. Constant pain is one of the most dangerous of those factors. Lack of sleep is another. Isolation amplifies both. Anyone who has gone even 2 or 3 days without proper sleep knows how strange the mind starts to feel. Thoughts become intrusive, emotions flatten or explode. Decision-making becomes irrational. Pain feels magnified. Time stretches and warps. People have done things they never thought possible, under far less pressure than this. That's why this story doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels grimly realistic. It also reflects how little respect dental pain used to receive. Even now, people joke about toothaches, but anyone who has experienced a severe abscess knows there's nothing funny about it. It's not just discomfort, it's torture that doesn't stop. Back then, the idea that dental pain could become a life-threatening or mentally devastating condition wasn't widely acknowledged. People were expected to endure it, to wait, to manage. This man tried to manage it. He probably thought he could handle it for a couple of weeks, that he'd push through the trip and deal with the tooth later. He likely had no idea how bad it would become, or how quickly his mental state would deteriorate once the pain and sleeplessness took hold. And once he realized he was in trouble, he had no way to get help, no signal, no road, no one coming. That realization alone can break a person. I think about the moment he wrote that note. Where was he sitting? What did he look like? Was he shaking, exhausted, feverish? Had he slept at all in days? Was his face swollen? Was the pain pulsing with every heartbeat? Did he hesitate? Did he cry? Did he try to tell himself to hold on 1 more hour, 1 more day? We'll never know. But the note suggests love, not anger, pain, not hatred, desperation, not malice. That's what makes it so sad. He didn't leave because he wanted to abandon his family. He left because he couldn't endure what his body and mind were putting him through, and he couldn't see another way out. Stories like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths. That pain is not just physical. That access to timely care matters more than people realize. That isolation can turn survivable problems into fatal ones, and that mental breaking points don't always come from weakness, but from overload. It also makes you think about how many people in the past suffered silently because they didn't have options, because they lived too far from care, because they were told to wait, because they believed they had to tough it out. Even now, with modern medicine, people underestimate how quickly things can go downhill when pain isn't controlled and sleep is lost. Add isolation and the risk multiplies. That's why I find this story hard not to believe. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet. Because it doesn't rely on unlikely coincidences. Because everything in it lines up with what we know about pain, sleep deprivation, and human psychology. And because people who work in dentistry will tell you without hesitation that untreated dental infections can ruin lives, physically and mentally. This story isn't about a man who wanted to die. It's about a man who wanted the pain to stop. And that distinction matters. It's a reminder that when we dismiss pain, minimize it, or delay care, the consequences aren't always visible right away. Sometimes they unfold far from view, in silence, in places where no one can intervene in time. And sometimes, by the time we realize how serious it was, all that's left is a note saying goodbye, and a family left wondering how something so small could end in something so final. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. This is the kind of story that changes the way you look at people, workplaces, and even your own sense of safety. Not because it's shocking in a loud, dramatic way, but because of how quietly it unfolds, how normal everything seems right up until it isn't. And once you've lived through something like this, even as a bystander, it never really leaves you. The first time it happened, it felt unreal from the very beginning. There was a woman who worked at my company, not in my department, but close enough that we collaborated on a project together. We exchanged emails, attended meetings, shared deadlines. She was one of those people everyone described the same way. Kind, patient, reliable. The kind of coworker who made work feel a little easier, just by being there. Then one day, she didn't come in. At first, no one thought much of it. People miss days, people get sick, people take personal time. It wasn't unusual. But then a mutual co-worker messaged me directly. The message was short and strange and immediately made my stomach drop. "I'm so sorry." That was it. No context, no explanation, just those 3 words. When I asked what they meant, the response came quickly, and it was like the ground shifted under me. She had been murdered in her home. I remember reading that sentence over and over, like my brain couldn't process it. Murdered, not passed away, not died unexpectedly, murdered. It felt too extreme to be connected to someone I'd just been working with, someone who had been alive and normal and professional the week before. Work stopped feeling real after that. Emails felt pointless. Meetings felt surreal. People whispered in hallways. Everyone was trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. I went to her funeral. A lot of us from work did. Her boss, several co-workers, people who knew her only in a professional setting but still felt the loss deeply. The service was heavy, filled with grief that felt almost physical. Her family sat in the front, shattered. Friends cried openly. People talked about how kind she was, how generous, how she always showed up for others. Her ex-husband was there. He sat with her family. He hugged them. He cried with them. He gave a eulogy that was so touching, it made people cry harder. He spoke about her warmth, her strength, how she loved being a mother. He sounded like a man who had lost someone he deeply cared about. No one questioned it. They had been divorced for years. It wasn't a fresh breakup. They lived nearby, yes, but nothing about his presence seemed inappropriate at the time. If anything, people seemed to find comfort in the fact that he was there, supporting the family. Then her son spoke. He was in his late teens, maybe older, but still young enough that his grief felt raw and unfiltered. When he stood up, the room went completely silent. He said something that struck everyone as incredibly mature and compassionate. "Whoever did this," he said, "I just want them to know that I forgive them." People cried even harder after that. It felt like an extraordinary act of grace. Forgiveness in the face of such violence. People whispered about how strong he was, how remarkable that was for someone so young. At the time, it felt like one of the most heartbreaking but somehow hopeful moments I'd ever witnessed. 2 weeks later, everything fell apart. The news broke quietly at first. Then it spread. Her ex-husband had been arrested. He was the one who killed her. The same man who sat with her family. The same man who hugged them. The same man who gave that beautiful eulogy. The same man everyone assumed was grieving alongside them. Her son knew. That detail is what truly breaks me when I think about it. Her son knew who had killed his mother when he stood up and spoke about forgiveness. He knew who he was forgiving. He knew the truth while the rest of his family sat there, unaware, mourning alongside the person responsible. I cannot imagine what was going through his mind in that moment, standing there, looking at his mother's family, knowing the man sitting among them had murdered her, choosing to speak about forgiveness anyway, carrying that knowledge alone, at least in that room. At that time, I can't imagine what the rest of the family felt when the truth came out. The shock, the betrayal, the horror of realizing they had embraced her killer, that they had let him sit with them, comfort them, speak over her coffin. It adds a layer of cruelty to an already unbearable loss. She had been the nicest lady. That wasn't just something people said because she was gone. It was genuinely how she moved through the world. She didn't cause conflict. She didn't have enemies. She wasn't someone you would ever associate with violence. They had been divorced for years. There was no ongoing drama that anyone knew about. No public warning signs. And yet, one day, completely out of the blue, he showed up at her front door and decided to kill her. No argument anyone witnessed. No escalation anyone could point to. Just a decision. That's the part that keeps you up at night. The idea that someone can live their life for years, appear normal, attend work functions, share custody, exist peacefully, and then one day decide to end another person's life. The randomness of it is terrifying. Not long after that, it happened again. Another co-worker didn't come into work. This time the reason was different, but the result was the same. He had gone to a Super Bowl party the night before. A normal thing. Something people do all the time. Friends, food, football, no reason to think anything bad would happen. Then the news broke about a shooting at a Super Bowl party. We started connecting the dots almost immediately. He had been there, and then the confirmation came. He had died. As more details came out, the story became painfully familiar. He was friends with the host. The host's ex-boyfriend showed up. Something escalated. He killed her. And then he killed anyone who tried to stop him from getting to her. People who were just there to watch a game. People who had no part in the conflict. People who made the mistake of trying to protect someone else. Gone. Just like that. Again, it was an ex. Again, it was someone who couldn't accept separation. Again, it was violence rooted in control, entitlement, and rage. It was too much. 2 murders connected to my workplace. 2 completely separate incidents. Different people, different settings, same underlying pattern. And it forces you to confront something deeply uncomfortable. This kind of violence isn't rare. It doesn't always look dramatic ahead of time. It doesn't always come with obvious warning signs that outsiders can see. Sometimes it hides behind normalcy, behind time passing, behind the assumption that if it were really dangerous, we would know. As someone who had been in an abusive relationship myself, these stories hit differently. Abuse doesn't always end when a relationship ends. Sometimes that's when it becomes most dangerous, and even when years pass, even when life appears to move on, the fear never fully goes away. You start asking questions you never used to ask. Will this person show up at my door in 10 years? Will they decide one day that they deserve access to me again? Will time make them calmer, or will it just give their anger more space to ferment? When you've lived through abuse, stories like these don't feel abstract. They feel personal. They feel like warnings. They confirm fears you've tried to push down. Fears people sometimes dismiss as paranoia. And then there's the reality of where I live. Texas, a place where guns are everywhere, where access is easy, where dangerous people don't have to work very hard to turn violent thoughts into lethal actions. I'm not naive. I know violence exists everywhere, but living in a place where firearms are so readily available adds another layer of anxiety to these stories. It means that moments of rage don't just end in shouting or threats. They can end in death very quickly. It also changes how you see everyday life. Coworkers stop being just coworkers. You start wondering what their home lives are like, what they're dealing with behind closed doors, what invisible risks exist in spaces that feel safe. Funerals stop feeling like closure. They start feeling like incomplete stories, especially when the truth doesn't come out right away. Forgiveness speeches stop feeling purely noble. They become layered with pain you may never fully understand. And kindness starts to feel fragile. What stays with me the most isn't just the violence itself. It's the deception. The way the ex-husband was able to move through that funeral, speaking lovingly about the woman he killed, while her family and co-workers believed him. The way he blended in so completely that no one questioned his presence. It makes you realize how little we truly know about the people around us. It also makes you think about how many warning signs might be missed because we want to believe the best in people. Because it's uncomfortable to imagine that someone we know, someone who seems normal, could be capable of something so monstrous. And then there's the son. I keep coming back to him. That moment where he stood up and spoke about forgiveness, knowing exactly who he was forgiving, knowing the truth while everyone else was in the dark. That kind of emotional burden is unimaginable. That kind of strength or survival instinct or numbness is something no teenager should ever have to develop. His words were taken as a sign of grace. In reality, they were a glimpse into something far heavier. These stories changed how I think about safety, relationships, and time. They destroyed the illusion that distance from an abusive partner always equals safety. They reinforced the idea that some people never truly let go of control, even when years pass. They also made me deeply aware of how sudden and final violence can be, how quickly a normal day can turn into a headline. See how easily life can be erased for reasons that make no sense to anyone but the person committing the act. There's so much loss in these stories. Loss that ripples outward, affecting families, workplaces, communities. Loss that leaves unanswered questions and permanent scars. And there's a particular kind of grief that comes with knowing the people who died were just living their lives. Going to work, attending parties, being kind, trusting that the past was behind them. They didn't do anything wrong. They just existed. And that's what makes it so hard to sit with. Because it means the danger wasn't in some obvious bad decision. It wasn't in risky behavior. It was in someone else's unresolved violence, someone else's inability to let go. These stories don't just make you sad. They make you vigilant. They make you think twice. They make you hold your loved ones a little closer, and trust your instincts a little more. They also make you angry. Angry that abusive people so often have access to weapons. Angry that warning signs are dismissed. Angry that survivors are told to move on without acknowledgement of how long fear can last. Mostly, though, they leave you with a heavy awareness that sometimes, no matter how kind someone is, no matter how much time has passed, no matter how normal things seem, violence can still erupt. And when it does, it leaves behind confusion, betrayal, and grief that no amount of time can fully erase. Just so much loss of life for no reason at all. When I think back to this story, what stays with me the most isn't just what happened, but how people reacted afterward. The crime itself was horrific, but the behavior of everyone around it revealed something just as disturbing. It showed how quickly people can switch from cruelty to performative grief, how easily sympathy can be turned on and off, and how little understanding there often is for the long shadow a tragedy casts. I was young when this happened, still in school. There was a boy in our class who came from a family that struggled financially. Everyone knew it, even if no one ever said it directly. His clothes were older, sometimes worn thin. He didn't have the newest gadgets or the nicest shoes. He wasn't the kid who showed up with brand-name backpacks or talked about expensive vacations. In a school environment, especially among kids, that kind of thing doesn't go unnoticed. Kids can be cruel without even realizing how cruel they're being. They don't always bully openly, but they make jokes, roll their eyes, whisper, exclude. They decide who matters and who doesn't, based on shallow things they barely understand themselves. This boy and his family existed on the lower rung of that invisible ladder, and people treated him accordingly. He had a younger brother. Like many kids at the time, his brother had an Xbox 360. It was a big deal back then. Online gaming was becoming more common, downloadable content was new, and buying things digitally felt almost unreal. Somehow the younger brother got access to their mother's credit card and started using it to buy things on the console. Skins, games, add-ons, whatever caught his attention. He was a kid. And kids don't understand money the way adults do. To him, it probably didn't feel real, just numbers on a screen, buttons you press. But for that family, money was very real. When the mother found out, she was furious, not in a dramatic or abusive way, from what I understand, but in a way that came from stress and fear. For families living paycheck to paycheck, unexpected charges aren't just annoying, they're terrifying. They can mean bills not getting paid, food getting rationed, late fees piling up. The punishment was simple and, to most people, reasonable. She took the Xbox away. For the younger brother, that punishment felt unbearable. To an adult, losing a game console is nothing. To a child, especially one who doesn't have much else, it can feel like the end of the world. It can feel like everything that brings comfort, distraction, and control has been ripped away. That doesn't excuse what happened next, but it helps explain how warped his thinking must have become. That night, while the family slept, the younger brother left his room. No one knows exactly what he was thinking. Anger, resentment, humiliation, desperation. Probably all of it mixed together in a way only a child's mind can manage. He somehow set the house on fire. It's still difficult to even write that sentence. The fire spread quickly. Houses aren't meant to burn, but when they do, they become traps. Smoke fills rooms faster than flames. People get disoriented. They don't wake up in time. They don't realize what's happening until it's already too late. 2 members of his family died that night. One of them was his older brother, the boy I went to school with. But I can't imagine the terror of those final moments. Being woken by smoke, the heat, the confusion, the realization that the place you think of as safe has turned into something lethal. And I can't imagine dying because of something your own sibling did, whether intentionally or not. The younger brother survived. The older brother didn't. The next day at school was surreal. News like that moves fast, especially in a school. Whispers spread through hallways. Teachers pull students aside. Classes are disrupted. Assemblies are held. Counselors appear where they normally aren't. Everything feels slightly unreal, like the building itself is holding its breath. People cried. A lot of people cried. What struck me immediately, even as a kid, was how many of those tears felt fake, or at least sudden in a way that didn't sit right. The same kids who had mocked him, ignored him, treated him like he didn't matter. Suddenly they were devastated. Suddenly they cared deeply. Suddenly they spoke about him like he had been their closest friend. It was like watching a switch flip. The day before, he was just that kid. The poor kid. The one people didn't invite to things. The one who got laughed at. The one people barely noticed unless it was to judge him. Now he was a tragedy. People talked about how sweet he was, how quiet, how sad it was that someone like him had died. They posted messages. They hugged each other. They looked for comfort in shared grief they hadn't earned. I remember sitting there and feeling angry, even though I didn't fully understand why at the time. It felt wrong. It felt dishonest. It felt like people were using his death to feel something about themselves, rather than actually caring about who he was when he was alive. No one talked about how he had been treated before. No one acknowledged how invisible he had been. No one apologized for the way they'd laughed at him or excluded him. It was easier to mourn a version of him that existed only after he was gone. And then there was the younger brother, the kid who had set the fire. People talked about him in whispers too, but very differently. Fear, anger, disgust, confusion. He was a child, but he was also the cause. That contradiction made people uncomfortable. They didn't know how to process it. Some people immediately labeled him a monster. Others avoided talking about him at all. No one wanted to sit with the reality that a child could do something so devastating, not out of pure evil, but out of a mix of immaturity, rage, and desperation. What does punishment even mean in a situation like that? How do you reconcile the fact that he lost family members too? That he would have to live the rest of his life knowing he caused their deaths? That no amount of punishment could ever match the weight of that knowledge? Those questions didn't have easy answers, and most people didn't want to ask them anyway. School eventually went back to normal in the way it always does after tragedy. Desks stayed in the same place. Bells rang. Homework was assigned. The world moved on with an unsettling efficiency. But something had shifted. I started noticing how performative grief can be. How people sometimes care more about being seen as caring than actually caring. How sympathy can be conditional, shallow, and temporary. How quickly people forget once the initial shock fades. The older brother's desk was empty. For a while, people mentioned it. Then they stopped. A new student filled the seat. Life continued, but that family was gone. Not just emotionally, but physically. Their house, their routine, their sense of safety. Everything burned away in a single night. The surviving members would never be the same, and yet the world around them expected them to adapt quietly. What haunted me most as I got older was realizing how preventable parts of this tragedy might have been. Not the initial mistake with the credit card, but everything surrounding it. The stress of poverty, the lack of support. The way small problems can snowball into catastrophic ones when there are no safety nets. And the way children absorb that stress without having the tools to process it. The younger brother didn't understand the consequences of fire the way adults do. He didn't understand how fast it spreads, how deadly smoke is, how impossible it can be to escape once it starts. He likely didn't intend to kill anyone. He wanted to punish back, to express anger, to regain control in the only way his child's mind could imagine. That doesn't make it less tragic. It makes it more so, because it means no one won. Not the family, not the community, not the kids at school who cried and then forgot. Not the younger brother who will carry that night with him forever. And certainly not the older brother whose life ended before he ever got the chance to escape the circumstances he was born into. When I think about that day at school, I think about how many people cried who hadn't cared the day before. How grief became a performance, a social obligation, a way to fit in. How easy it is to be kind once someone is gone, and how much harder it is to be kind when it actually matters. This story doesn't scare me in the way ghost stories do. It scares me because it's real, because it shows how thin the line is between normal life and irreversible tragedy, how a single moment fueled by emotion and misunderstanding can destroy an entire family. It also scares me because of what it says about us, about how we treat people when they're alive, about how we decide who deserves empathy, about how quickly we rewrite history once it's too late to change it. I still remember that boy, not the version people talked about after he died, but the quiet kid who sat in class, trying not to draw attention to himself. The kid who deserved more kindness than he got. The kid whose life ended because of a chain of failures far bigger than one bad decision. And I remember the way everyone cried the next day, not because they lost him, but because losing him gave them permission to feel something without having to change anything about themselves. A few years back, my whole family went on a big vacation to Disney World. There were about 13 of us in total, spread across different ages, different personalities, different energy levels. It was one of those rare trips where everyone managed to be together at the same place at the same time, which already made it feel special before we even left home. We stayed at one of the Disney resorts, the kind that's designed to feel calm and magical, even after you've been overwhelmed all day by crowds, noise, rides, and heat. Every day followed a similar rhythm. We'd wake up early, pile onto buses or boats, spend hours walking through the parks, standing in lines, laughing, getting tired, getting cranky. Then slowly make our way back to the resort as the sun went down. By the time night came, most of the adults were exhausted, feet hurt, backs hurt. Everyone wanted showers, air conditioning, and sleep. But kids don't run on the same fuel. My daughter especially still had energy left at the end of the day. And honestly, I did too, just not the kind that wanted more rides or crowds. So almost every night after dinner, and after most people turned in, my daughter and I would go outside. We'd play catch. We'd throw a frisbee. Sometimes we'd just walk around the resort grounds together, talking about the day, replaying our favorite moments, laughing about silly things that happened. It became our quiet routine, just the two of us. A little pocket of calm after the chaos of Disney. One of our favorite spots was a small beach area on the resort property. It wasn't a big beach, not like an ocean beach. It was more like a carefully designed stretch of sand along the water, meant to look peaceful and inviting. There were lounge chairs nearby, soft lighting, palm trees. The water was calm, dark, and still, reflecting the lights from the resort buildings. At night, it felt almost unreal, like a postcard. We spent a lot of time there. We'd throw the frisbee back and forth, our feet sinking slightly into the sand. Sometimes we'd sit and talk. Sometimes we'd just enjoy the quiet. It felt safe, controlled, like everything at Disney is supposed to feel. You don't go there expecting danger. You go there expecting rules, boundaries, and protection, especially at a place that markets itself as family-friendly above all else. Looking back, that sense of safety was probably the most powerful part of the experience. Disney doesn't feel like the real world. It feels managed, curated, watched. like nothing truly bad could happen there. That illusion is strong, especially when you're there with your child, watching them laugh and run around without fear. The trip itself was wonderful, truly. One of those vacations you look back on and smile. We made memories, took photos, had inside jokes that still come up sometimes. When we finally packed up and flew home, it felt bittersweet, like all good trips do. Life went back to normal, work, school, routine. About a week later, I saw the news. At first, I didn't fully register it. It was just another headline scrolling past. Something about a child, a resort, an accident. Then I read it again more carefully. A small child had been dragged into the water and killed by an alligator at a Disney resort, on a beach. For a moment, my brain refused to connect the dots. It felt like those words couldn't possibly belong together. Disney, child, alligator, death. It didn't make sense. It felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe, like hearing about a murder in a place you associate with birthdays and fireworks. Then the details came into focus. It was the same resort, the same little beach, the same place where my daughter and I had played almost every night. That realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I remember sitting there, staring at the screen, feeling this cold wave wash over me. My stomach dropped. My hands actually started to shake. I kept rereading the article, hoping I'd misunderstood something, hoping it was a different location, a different beach, a different body of water. But it wasn't. It was the Grand Floridian, the exact place, the exact stretch of sand. The water that had looked so calm and harmless, while we stood there laughing and throwing a frisbee. The child had been near the water's edge when an alligator grabbed him and pulled him in. It happened quickly, shockingly quickly. There was no time to react in any meaningful way. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. I can't even begin to imagine what those parents went through in that moment. The sound, the confusion, the disbelief, the horror of realizing that something so violent was happening in a place that felt so safe. As a parent, your mind doesn't want to go there. It actively resists imagining that kind of pain. But once you know, once you've read it, once you've stood in that exact place with your own child, it's impossible not to think about it. What if we had been there one more week? What if my daughter had wandered closer to the water? What if we had been sitting right at the edge instead of a little farther back? What if I had looked away for just a moment? Those questions don't have answers, and that's what makes them so disturbing. There's no lesson that neatly ties it up. No simple rule that would have guaranteed safety. We weren't doing anything reckless. We weren't ignoring warning signs. There were no visible barriers screaming danger. At the time, there weren't even clear signs warning about alligators. That's another part that's hard to wrap your head around. Florida is alligator country. Anyone who lives there knows that. But when you're a tourist, especially at Disney, that reality fades into the background. The water looks decorative, controlled, like part of the scenery. It doesn't register as wild. But it was wild. Alligators don't care about branding or property lines. They don't care that a place is meant to be magical. Water is water to them. And that beach, no matter how carefully designed, was still connected to a natural ecosystem. The news coverage was intense for a while. People were shocked, angry, confused. Questions were asked about signage, safety measures, responsibility. Disney eventually put up warning signs and changed policies around water access. But none of that brings a child back. And none of it erases the image from your mind once you realize how close you were to the same outcome. For days after I read that story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every memory of that vacation replayed in a different light. Moments that had felt peaceful now felt fragile. The beach at night, the still water, the sense of calm. All of it felt like a thin layer over something dangerous. I kept seeing my daughter running across the sand, laughing, asking me to throw the frisbee higher, sitting beside me while we talked about nothing important. And then I'd picture that same place, empty, cordoned off, filled with police and emergency responders. The contrast was unbearable. What messed with me the most was how random it felt. This wasn't a case of someone ignoring obvious danger signs or taking a known risk. It wasn't someone swimming where they shouldn't have been. It was a child standing near water at a resort specifically designed for families. That randomness is terrifying. It means safety isn't always about making the right choices. Sometimes it's about timing, about luck, about being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Also, even if that place is supposed to be safe. I also couldn't stop thinking about how unaware we were at the time. We walked that beach without a second thought. We let our guard down completely. Not because we were careless parents, but because the environment encouraged it. Disney trains you to relax, to trust, to believe that everything has been thought through, and usually that trust is rewarded. But nature doesn't follow plans. Alligators don't care about lighting design or guest experiences. They don't read brochures. They don't know they're not supposed to be there. The idea that something so ancient and primal could intersect so violently with such a modern, controlled environment is deeply unsettling. It's like two realities colliding, one built on fantasy and safety, the other on instinct and survival. Even now, years later, I still get a strange feeling when I think about that trip. It doesn't erase the good memories. I don't regret going. I don't regret those nights with my daughter. If anything, they feel even more precious now. But there's an edge to them, a quiet awareness of how close things can get without you ever realizing it. Sometimes I think about how many families were probably on that same beach after we left. How many parents stood where we stood, watching their kids play, feeling relaxed and happy, unaware of what would happen later. It makes you realize how often danger hides behind normal moments. Not in obvious ways, not with warning sirens or flashing lights, but in the background, waiting for a perfect, terrible intersection of circumstances. I've heard people say things like, well, that's Florida, or people should know better, or Disney should have done more. And maybe all of that is true in different ways, but none of it really addresses the core horror of the situation, which is this. A family went on vacation. They trusted a place built on trust, and their child never came home. That's the part that doesn't fade. Every time someone mentions the Grand Floridian now, there's a tiny flicker in my brain, a brief, involuntary moment where the memory surfaces, the image of that beach, the sound of water, the knowledge of what happened there. And yes, sometimes it gives me a tiny freak out. Not because I think it's going to happen again to me personally, but because it shattered an illusion I didn't even realize I had. The illusion that certain places are exempt from tragedy, that if a place is polished enough, famous enough, loved enough, nothing truly awful can happen there. That illusion died on that beach. The world is messy. Nature doesn't pause for vacations. And safety is never as absolute as we want it to be. I still think about that child sometimes, about how quickly everything changed for him and his family, about how unfair it all was, and about how close my own family came to sharing that same space at a different moment in time. It's a sobering thought, one that stays with you long after the fireworks fade and the vacation photos are put away. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't about things that happened to you, they're about things that almost did. When my auntie tells this story, she always laughs a little, like it's something absurd rather than terrifying. But every time I hear it, I feel my stomach tighten because I know exactly how differently it could have ended. It's one of those moments that sounds almost unreal now, especially when you think about how much the world has changed. But it happened, and it says a lot about who she is. This was a long time ago, back in what people often call more innocent days. Doors weren't always locked the way they are now. Neighborhoods felt quieter. People assumed that if something bad happened, it would happen somewhere else, to someone else. My auntie lived alone at the time, in a modest house. Nothing fancy. She was independent, strong-willed, and practical. She had always been the kind of person who didn't panic easily. Still isn't. That night started like any other. She went to bed at her usual time, locked up as she normally did, and settled in. There was nothing unusual, no strange noises, no sense of unease. Just a normal night, the kind you don't think twice about. At some point in the night, she woke up. She didn't wake up screaming or gasping. She woke up because something felt off. She described it as a shift in the air, like when you suddenly realize you're not alone, even though you can't immediately explain why. Her room was dark, quiet. Nothing obvious had changed. She lay there for a moment, listening. That's when she noticed movement. Very slow, very careful. At the foot of her bed. Someone was under it. Most people, myself included, would have frozen instantly, or screamed, or pulled the covers over their head and pretended it wasn't happening. But my auntie didn't do any of those things. She said her brain clicked into a strange kind of calm, the kind you don't know you're capable of until you're forced into it. The man under her bed had been hiding there. How long he had been there, she didn't know. That thought alone is horrifying. The idea that someone could be in your bedroom, under your bed, while you're asleep, breathing quietly, waiting. It's the kind of thing that crawls into your mind later and refuses to leave. She could see part of him as he started to emerge, not his face, just his legs. That's when she acted. She didn't think about what she was doing. She didn't stop to weigh the risks. She moved on instinct. She swung her legs out of bed and sat down hard, right on top of his legs, pinning them in place. Just like that, she sat on him. The man under the bed froze. He struggled for a moment, but there was nowhere for him to go. His upper body was still trapped under the bed frame, and his legs were now firmly pinned beneath my auntie's weight. She's not a small woman, never has been. Strong, solid, and absolutely not someone you want sitting on you when you're trying to escape. Only then did she start yelling. She screamed for the police. She screamed for help. She screamed loud enough that neighbors could hear. She didn't let up for a second. She stayed right where she was, keeping her weight down, not giving him an inch. The man panicked. According to her, he didn't try to fight her. He didn't try to attack. He didn't even yell back. He just started begging her to let him go. His voice was shaking. He sounded terrified. That detail always sticks with me. A burglar, and I'm hiding under a woman's bed in the middle of the night, and he was the one who ended up scared. She kept screaming until she heard sirens. Only then did she feel the adrenaline start to shake through her body. Only then did her hands begin to tremble. She said that up until that moment it was like she was running on pure instinct, like her body had taken over and decided what needed to be done. The police arrived quickly. They rushed in, guns drawn, expecting chaos. What they found instead was my auntie sitting on the legs of a burglar, yelling at him to stay still. They pulled him out from under the bed and cuffed him. One of the officers actually laughed in disbelief, not because it was funny, but because it was so unexpected. Another officer told her later that the man had looked visibly relieved when they arrived. Relieved. That part is almost surreal. The person who broke into her home, who hid under her bed, was relieved to see the police because it meant he didn't have to deal with her anymore. That says everything you need to know about how firmly she had the situation under control. The police told her afterward that she was incredibly lucky, that things could have gone very differently, that she could have been hurt. She listened politely, nodded, thanked them, and then went about her life. To her, it was just something that happened. To me, it's one of the most unbelievable acts of courage I can imagine. I think about that moment often, about the presence of mind it took to do something so decisive. about how most people freeze when they're confronted with fear and how she didn't. She didn't hesitate. She didn't give herself time to panic. See, I know for a fact I would not have done what she did. I try to imagine myself waking up, realizing someone is under my bed, and reacting with that level of calm and control. I can't. I know myself well enough to admit that. I would have screamed, bolted, or locked up completely. Sitting on a burglar's legs until police arrived would not even register as an option in my brain. That's what makes her such a badass. Not in a flashy, dramatic way, not in a way that looks impressive on a screen, but in a very real, grounded human way. She took control of a terrifying situation and refused to give it power over her. It also makes me think about how different times were back then. People didn't talk as openly about home invasions, about trauma, about how deeply those moments can affect you long after they're over. She never went to therapy for it, never called it traumatic, never framed herself as a victim, but even so, you can tell it left its mark. She always checks under her bed now, always has. She laughs about that too, but she does it every single time. Habit born from experience. There's also something unsettling about how close danger can be without you knowing. That man didn't break in while she was awake. He didn't make noise. He didn't confront her directly. He hid. He waited. He was there while she slept. That's the part that gives me chills. Not the confrontation, not the sitting on him, but the time before that. The unknown stretch of minutes or hours when he was already inside her home, already in her bedroom, already under her bed. It makes you realize how thin the line between safety and danger can be. How quickly a normal night can turn into something out of a nightmare. And yet, instead of being paralyzed by that thought, my auntie embodies the opposite. She reminds me that sometimes people surprise even themselves with what they're capable of. That courage doesn't always look like bravery in the movies. Sometimes it looks like sitting down hard and refusing to move. The police told her she was lucky, and she was. There's no denying that. But luck wasn't the only factor. Her reaction mattered. Her refusal to panic mattered. Her willingness to act mattered. Whenever I think about that story, I feel a strange mix of fear and admiration. Fear because of how close she came to something truly awful. Admiration because of how she handled it. She's still like that now. Older, wiser, still not skinny, still strong. But still someone you don't mess with. She doesn't see herself as brave. She doesn't tell the story to impress anyone. To her, it's just one of those things that happened. But to me, it's a reminder that sometimes the people we underestimate, or the people who don't fit the usual image of a hero, are the ones who keep their heads when it matters most. A reminder that presence of mind can be more powerful than strength. And a reminder that real-life courage often shows up quietly, unexpectedly, and without asking for applause. I don't know what went through that burglar's mind while he was trapped under the bed. I don't know how long he had been there or what he planned to do next. I don't even know what happened to him afterward. Those details don't matter much to me. What matters is that my auntie walked away unharmed. That she took control of a moment that could have defined her life in a very different way. That she proved, without even meaning to, just how formidable she really is. And every time I hear the story, I think the same thing. If that had been me, I don't think I would have had the presence of mind to do what she did. But I'm glad someone did. I remember this so clearly that even now, years later, it feels less like a memory and more like a scene frozen in time. Not because anything dramatic happened in that moment, but because of how quietly close something terrible came to happening and how long it took for the truth to surface. I was 7 years old. At that age, the world still felt small and safe. Nighttime was something you were aware of. but not something you truly feared yet. Darkness was more about bedtime rules than danger. If something scared you, you expected an adult to explain it away, and most of the time, that explanation was enough. That night, it was around 10 p.m., which felt very late to me back then. I had gone to bed earlier, but I remember waking up hungry. It wasn't unusual. I was a kid who always seemed to want a snack before sleep really settled in. I remember padding quietly down the hallway, careful not to wake anyone, the house dim and quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists late at night when everyone else is already asleep. The kitchen was at the back of the house and also served as the back entrance. There was a door with a glass panel in it that looked out into the yard. During the day, it was just a normal door. At night, especially with the lights off outside, it became something else entirely, a dark window into the unknown. I remember flipping on a small light in the kitchen, not the overhead one, just enough to see where I was going. I opened the cupboard, grabbed something quick, and turned toward the door without really thinking. That's when I saw it. Through the glass of the back door, there was a man standing outside. At first, my brain didn't even process it as a person. It was just movement. A beam of light, a flashlight cutting through the darkness and sweeping slowly back and forth as if whoever was holding it was searching for something. Then I realized someone was holding it. I could see the shape of him. Not clearly enough to make out a face, but clearly enough to know there was an adult man standing right outside our house, in the dark, shining a flashlight around. My body reacted before my mind did. I screamed. It wasn't a polite or controlled scream. It was raw, high-pitched, full panic, the kind of scream that comes from a place deep in your chest when something inside you recognizes danger before you understand it. I dropped whatever was in my hands and ran. I don't even remember touching the floor properly. I just remember bolting down the hallway as fast as my legs could carry me, screaming and crying at the same time. I burst into my parents' room, completely hysterical, trying to get the words out through sobs and fear. "There's a man outside," I remember yelling. "There's a man at the door." My parents shot up immediately. Lights came on, voices overlapped, questions were asked all at once. My dad got up and went to look. My mom grabbed me and held me tight, telling me everything was okay, telling me to breathe, telling me I was safe. Within minutes, the situation was explained. They told me it was a maintenance man, someone checking something outside, someone who belonged there, someone doing his job late at night, nothing to be scared of. They said it calmly, reassuringly, confidently, and because I was 7, I believed them. That's what kids do. They trust adults, especially their parents. If your parents tell you there's nothing to worry about, your brain adjusts itself around that information. The fear doesn't disappear instantly, but it softens. It becomes embarrassment. You feel silly for being so scared. You feel relieved that it wasn't something worse. I remember my parents walking me back to bed. I remember my mom sitting with me for a few minutes until I calmed down. I remember feeling shaky but safe. I remember thinking maybe I had imagined how scary it was. Eventually, I fell asleep, and life went on. For years, that memory existed in a strange, muted way. It was just a childhood scare, a story that occasionally popped into my head but didn't carry much weight. Sometimes I'd remember the flashlight. Sometimes I'd remember how fast my heart had been beating, but it was always followed by the explanation. Maintenance man. Nothing happened. End of story. Or so I thought. Fast forward 9 years. I was 16. By then, my understanding of the world had changed completely. I was old enough to know that danger was real, that bad things happen to ordinary people, and that parents sometimes lie to protect their children. I was also old enough to revisit old memories with a more critical eye. I don't remember exactly why the topic came up. It might have been a conversation about break-ins or childhood fears or something we were watching on TV. But somehow that night came up. The night I screamed about the man outside the kitchen door. I laughed a little when I mentioned it. The way people do when they talk about something that scared them as a kid, but doesn't anymore. "Remember when I thought there was a man outside?" I said. "And it was just a maintenance guy?" The room went quiet. Not dramatically, not in a movie way, just a subtle shift. A pause that lasted a little too long. A look exchanged between my parents that I noticed immediately. That's when my stomach dropped. My mom looked at my dad. My dad looked away. Then he sighed. And that's when they told me the truth. It wasn't a maintenance man. There was no scheduled maintenance. No one who was supposed to be there. No harmless explanation. It was an armed robber. Someone had been outside our house that night, shining a flashlight around, trying to see inside, trying to find a way in, trying to determine if anyone was awake. The reason my parents had told me it was a maintenance man was simple. They didn't want to terrify a 7-year-old. They didn't want me lying awake at night for years, imagining armed strangers outside our home. They didn't want me to grow up afraid of my own kitchen, my own door, my own house. So they lied. They called the police that night after calming me down. They locked everything. They stayed awake. They watched. They listened. The man never came inside. Either he left on his own, or he was scared off by the noise, or he realized someone was awake, but he was real, and he was dangerous. Hearing that at 16 hit me harder than the original event ever had. Suddenly the memory rewrote itself. The flashlight wasn't neutral anymore. It wasn't a worker checking something. It was someone scanning our home, looking for an opportunity. The glass door wasn't just a door. It was a barrier between my family and someone who might have hurt us. And the worst part, if I hadn't gone for that snack, I might never have seen him. If I hadn't screamed, he might have tried the door, or a window, or waited longer. That thought still makes my chest tighten. I keep thinking about how close that moment was to turning into something else entirely. How a small, ordinary decision made by a hungry kid at 10 p.m. could have changed everything. I also think about my parents. At the time, I had seen them as calm, reassuring, in control. Now I realize how terrified they must have been, hearing their child scream in the middle of the night, realizing there was an armed stranger outside, making the split-second decision to protect me emotionally as well as physically. They carried that truth alone for 9 years. They lived with the knowledge of how close someone came to breaking into our home, how close their child came to being face-to-face with something truly dangerous. And they chose to shield me from it until I was old enough to understand. That kind of realization changes how you see your parents. It also changes how you see your own memories. That night stopped being just a childhood scare. It became something much darker, something unfinished. A moment where danger brushed past our lives and kept moving, leaving only a shadow behind. Even now, as an adult, I think about it when I'm in a kitchen at night, when I see a reflection in glass, when I notice an unexpected light outside. My brain goes right back there, to that moment of instinctive fear that turned out to be completely justified. What scares me the most isn't the robber himself. It's how quiet it was. No breaking glass, no forced door, no confrontation. Just a man with a flashlight standing in the dark, watching, assessing. That's the kind of danger you don't hear until it's too late. And it makes you realize something important. Sometimes children sense things. Adults try to explain away. Sometimes fear isn't imagination. Sometimes it's perception. 7-year-old me didn't know what an armed robber was. I didn't understand intent or crime or risk. But my body knew something was wrong. My instincts were right. And that might be the most unsettling part of all. That the fear I felt wasn't childish or irrational. It was accurate. It just took 9 years for the truth to catch up with it. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.